All right, well, let's rewind our chronology back to 800, and let's look at monastic reform. Okay, good. Now again, the last time we talked about monasticism in the West, we talked about Benedict of Nursia, and the Benedictine rule and Benedictine monasticism, which became the pattern for monasticism in the West, because Gregory the Great, was Pope, or was Bishop of Rome, at the time when the Benedict's monastery there in Monte Cassino was sacked by the Lombards. They dispersed to Rome. Gregory was so impressed by the Benedictine rule that he sent those monks out to establish other monasteries following that rule. So Gregory, with his appreciation and admiration of Benedictine monasticism, established that as the pattern throughout the West. Well, it was during this period of time that we have barbarians coming from the Northmen, or Norsemen. Later, we have Normandy and the Normans, okay, all originating from these men from the north. And then the Hungarians from the east. They were coming in to the west, and they destroyed a number of these monasteries. All right, they were places of where they had agriculture, livestock, possessions, wealth. So they would come in and sack them and destroy them. And then there were some that survived, but in the situation where we have such unstable civilization, monasteries become a place of refuge for those seeking some stability and seeking the communal life. It's better to share a little than to have nothing all to yourself. And so monasteries are growing, but for those who have the position of abbot, instead of having a heart of servant leadership, they are taking advantage of their situation as head of the monastery to live lives of luxury. So again, we see simony. We have abbots that are buying their positions, or they're gaining them through homicide. They're actually working their way up the system by murder so that they could enjoy the easy life. The Benedictine rule was ignored. The Benedictine rule insisted that every person participate in the labor of the monastery. But some abbots began to ignore that rule. And then there were monks who felt called to the monastic life, who wanted to come and live a life of devotion and study and service, but for them their vocation was violated because of the decline of monasticism during the 800s. So we come to 909. And William of Aquitaine is a nobleman with land in France, and he donates the property at Cluny for a monastery, and he places in charge a man named Berno. And Berno then was the abbot from 909 to 926. After Berno, there was a series of very high-minded abbots over a period of 200 years. And so Cluny enjoyed very strong leadership with integrity, who had a vision of reforming the church through a series of monasteries. So from Cluny, they would have other daughter monasteries that would be established throughout the West, following the same principles that had been set up by Barano, the great organizer, Peter the Venerable, 1122 to 1157. So they expanded the ideals of monastic reform throughout Europe. Now, here was their principles of the Cluniac reform. Number one, they opposed simony. They opposed the idea of purchasing church positions. They forbade clerical marriage. Right? They insisted on celibacy among the clergy, whether it was the priests or the monks. They promoted obedience. The monks were obedient to their superiors, and they were obedient to the Benedictine rule. The church would be obedient to the Pope, and they had the expectation that the Pope would head a great renewal. All right, remember, when was Cluny established? 909. What was going on in the papacy during the same period of time? 904 to 962? Pornocracy. All right, so at the time when Cluny is being established, the papacy is going through one of its lowest periods of corruption. So why would Cluny insist on obedience to the Pope? Well, their goal was that they would place someone in the papacy who then would bring a top-down reformation. All right, do you remember what we just said about Pope Leo IX? Where did he come from? He came from Cluny. All right, same thing with Gregory VII, same thing with Urban II. These were popes that came out of the monastery at Cluny. They were inspired by the principles of the Cluniac reform, and so the monastery at Cluny and their daughter monasteries eventually did have great influence on the church by placing their members in the position of pope. Okay. They had a centralized organization, one abbey with branch houses. Okay, now we've already talked about their principles, but there was always ambivalence regarding poverty. All right, now Benedict had commanded that every monk commit to poverty, give up everything they own, and share everything in common. Well, eventually, the philosophy was that a good monk would own nothing, but a monastery could own vast properties and wealth. And how did the monasteries gain their wealth? One, they had property. Remember, during this period of time, property was really the sole measure of wealth, because of the income you would get from agriculture and livestock and other uses of the land. Well, another thing that would happen is that the nobility would give would send their children to the monasteries. For one reason, this was the policy was what we call primogeniture, the idea that the oldest son would inherit the property of the family. Well, what do you do with the other sons? What do you do with the daughters? Many times they go into the military, or the daughters would marry other nobility, and that's how they would take care of their children. But another option was to send their sons and daughters into the monasteries. So when they do that, then they would settle on those monasteries the inheritance that they would have given to those sons and daughters. So that money then would go into the monastery. Another source of income for the monasteries was prayer. How can you earn money by prayer? doctrine of purgatory and praying for the dead. All right? A noble person, a noble family could make a contribution to the monastery with a provision that those monks who pray would pray for the members of that family, praying in perpetuity for them to be released from purgatory into heaven. Right? Because that was one way of being released from purgatory into heaven was by the prayers of those on the earth. So the monks prayed 8 times a day. A big part of those prayers were praying through the Psalms and worshipful prayers, but another aspect of those prayers was intercession for the dead. All right, so there was a third way that the monasteries could receive income. So monasteries became very wealthy, even though individual monks may have lived in poverty. The monasteries then had considerable wealth, and so those who were abbots and abbesses had control over a lot of wealth, and they could create very luxurious lifestyles for themselves. So the wealth of the monasteries then invited Simon. So the Cluniac reform was turned upside down, because all of a sudden, to be the abbot or the abbess at a Cluniac monastery was a way of living a luxurious life. And so then they began to purchase those positions, thereby denying one of the great principles of the Cluniac reform. One abbot at Cluny said, "I found Cluny wood and I left it marble." Okay, so during his tenure, he had beautified the monastery and made it luxurious instead of being simple. All right. So what happens when one reform movement fails? Other reform movements developed. The next major movement was the Cistercian movement. Almost 200 years later, Robert of Moulins founded a monastery at Citeaux. Citeaux had formerly been known by the Latin name Cistercium, and so this became the Cistercian movement, right, among monastic movements, the Cistercian movement. It returned to Benedictine simplicity with plain facilities, strict diet, manual labor, and agriculture. One of the things that they became known for was that the nobility would donate to the Cistercians land that otherwise was unusable. Say it was heavily forested, or it was a wilderness, or maybe it was swamp land. It was land that the nobility themselves had been unable to use, but they gave it to the Cistercians. Well, with the access to human labor that they had through the monks, they could work and reclaim that land. The land that had been unusable, all of a sudden it became productive again in ways of agriculture or livestock. But they had access to plentiful manual labor through those who were working there, who were serving as monks. The most famous of the Cistercian monks was Bernard of Clairvaux. I don't believe anyone is writing on Bernard in here. It's a shame. He was really the leading figure in the 12th century in the church. He was a gifted preacher, and he was a powerful persuader. Whenever he came to town to recruit monks, the women would say, "Hide your men, hide your husbands, hide your sons, hide your brothers," because Bernard was coming and he was going to convince these men to leave their families and go into the monastery. But he also was gifted in meditation, Many of his writings are known for their spiritual devotion. Dr. Dan Holcomb has created a course in Christian devotional classics, and one of the authors that he emphasizes is Bernard Clairvaux. The champion of ecclesiastical reform. He influenced popes, and Eugenius III came out of the Cistercian movement, and Bernard was very influential in placing him in the papacy. He was the enemy of theological innovation, very conservative. When we get to talking about early scholasticism, we'll talk about Peter Abelard, and we'll talk about how Peter Abelard wrote a treatise, Yes and No, kind of questioning some of the church's laws and principles, and Bernard, boy, he was merciless in attacking Peter Abelard. Abelard ended up in a monastery. He was the preacher of the Second Crusade. We'll talk about the Crusades next week, but he was when Urban II was the major instigator of the First Crusade. When it was time, when it was believed that the church needed to send a second wave of crusaders, Bernard was the one who was preaching and encouraging the nobility to send their knights on the Second Crusade. Well, unfortunately, the Second Crusade was a failure, and so when the Crusaders returned, then Bernard kind of had to retool his sermons, and he said the reason for their failure was the sin and corruption of the church, and so he used that as a call for repentance. And then he was a great hymn writer, and there are at least 2 hymns that are sung today, although we don't sing hymns much anymore in churches today. So it's sad to say, but nonetheless, at least I'm familiar with these hymns, especially O Sacred Head, now wounded, but with grief and shame weighed down. Now scornfully surrounded with thorns, thine only crown. How pale thou art with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn. How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? Anybody heard that hymn? All right, that's okay. Oh, Frank has. All right, it's really, I've got it on a collection of hymns. It's a beautiful hymn. Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills the breast, but sweeter far thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. All right, so he was a hymn writer, and really in Bernard we see evidence of spirituality in the medieval church. I spent the first part of our lecture talking about the pornocracy, talking about the feudal church, talking about the union of church and state. And so there are many aspects of the medieval church which are dismaying to us. Of course, at the same time, we also talk about the desires evidence in Leo IX and Gregory VII and Urban II to reform the church. But here we see at least one individual, Bernard Clairvaux, who has a spiritual devotional life that is worthy of our study, our reading, our interest, and our imitation. All right. There are other things about Bernard that perhaps we would not appreciate so much, but you know what? We can say that about a lot of people. There's some good and some bad. There's some right and some wrong, but there's a lot of good in Bernard. Well, there are some other monastic orders that developed during this time. The Carthusians were a harshly ascetic lifestyle and lived in individual cells. The Carmelites are interesting because they were founded in 1154 in connection with the Crusades on Mount Carmel, and I've visited Mount Carmel, so has Lakin, and that's the place where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal and called the fire down and defeated them, and there's a great statue of Elijah there. But it was on this, there's a monastery there that we visit that is associated with the Carmelite monastic movement. And then the Augustinians are another order created during this time. Well, we have the orders founded by the Crusaders, the Knights Hospitallers, and the Knights Templars. I'm going to postpone our discussion of these two orders until next week, because since they come out of the Crusades, we'll have more occasion next week to talk about them and to understand them. But everybody's heard of the Knights Templar. Okay, if you watch movies, you've heard of them. All right, National Treasure. What's that? The Da Vinci Code. Thank you very much. Yes, we've all heard about the Knights Templar. We'll learn a little bit more about them next week. All right, what's the attraction of monasticism anyway? For us, it seems so. I don't know, maybe even repellent is not too strong a word, but it certainly seems foreign to us to live the monastic lifestyle. I guess if you live in a men's dorm, maybe not so foreign. But there's this belief in labor and devotion and asceticism as being a way to gain merit. All right, we talked about in church history, when we move out of the period of martyrdom into the legalization of Christianity and the Christianization of the empire, martyrdom was no longer a way to prove one's devotion. So monasticism then was elevated as a way for the true Christian athlete to demonstrate his or her devotion to God. And so there's this idea that the monastic life earned merit through labor, devotion, and asceticism. There was encouragement from the popes toward the monastic life because the monks, especially those in the Cluniac movement, were devoted to the pope. There was an unstable situation in Europe, threats of invasion, and so for many, the monastic life offered security. Again, if you were living on your own, you lived in a very unstable, risky situation. You're in danger from the invasion of barbarians. You're on your own, subject to the unpredictableness of life. And so life in the monastery then becomes appealing because you live communally. You can share in common, and that gives stability and access to material support, food, clothing, shelter. There was a desire for education because the monasteries became the place where you could go for school. One of the functions of the monasteries was to copy manuscripts, and so this is a place where you could learn to read and to write. And then great monastic preachers became vehicles for proselytizing, as we've already discussed about Bernard. Monks became adept at copying the Bible and other books. There are many of the ancient classics, certainly Bibles, also our Christian writings were preserved for us in the monasteries. Houses became teaching centers, hospitals, pharmacies, and hotels. If you were on a pilgrimage, or if you were just traveling from place to place, many times you would go to a monastery for a place to stay, or if you needed medical attention. Monks were trained in health care. Monasteries preserve the culture of the past. They They provided a source of education. Um, the Cistercians especially cultivated unused land and made it productive. And monasticism allowed opportunities for women to serve the church and to lead. All right. Now, Lacan did her paper on Catherine of Siena. Okay. Now, Catherine actually did not live in a monastery. She was a tertiary of the Dominican order, which means that she allied herself with the Dominicans. We'll talk about them in a couple of weeks. But tertiaries were those who were allowed to live out in the world, and they were actually allowed to marry, but she did not. But she was connected to the Dominicans. We'll hear more from Lacan about Catherine in another week or two. But nonetheless, Catherine is an example of a woman who took on a leadership position through a monastic movement. Hildegard von Bingen, no one wanted to write a paper about her, but she is fascinating. She was an abbess of the monastery at Bingen, and she was a powerful leader. She was a writer. She was a spiritualist. She actually went on preaching tours up and down the Rhine River, and she had the support of Bernard of Clairvaux in doing so. And you can imagine that Bernard, being that supporter of conservatism, if she had his support, she must have been pretty good. And she said that she was out preaching because the men weren't out preaching. So she said, because if the men will step up and fulfill their duty in preaching, that she would return to the monastery. But she was out there preaching because the men were not. So anyway, we do have a number of women leading in monasteries. Well, we do have some problems in monasticism. All right. In many cases, there were those monasteries that discredited the Christian life because they perceived the monks, especially the abbots, as living lives of wealth and ease. Many of them lived immoral lives, but then they were assigned only life penance and then were absolved. So there were those monks who were corrupt, and so they discredited the Christian life. They became, centers of corruption, of greed, intolerance. They drained Europe of productive land. So much of the land in Europe was owned and operated by the monasteries, undercut married life because of their insistence on celibacy. And even though we see some positive influence from the Cluniac movement on the papacy, nonetheless, when you think about these monks being obedient tools of the papacy, then they could be abused and support a system that was corrupt. All right, we do know that that when the Reformation had such an impact on the church in the West, that in no place where the Protestant Reform took place did they continue the practice of monasticism. All right, monasticism was eliminated under the Lutheran Reform, under the Swiss Reform, under Zwingli and Calvin in England after the English Reformation. All of the monasteries were taken over by the state and then redistributed. As you learn when we study Luther, Frederick the Wise, after the Reformation, he confiscated the Augustinian monastery where Luther had served. He gave it to Luther and his wife Katie, and Katie turned it into a hotel. But that's just one example of how all the monasteries were taken over wherever the Protestant Reformation held sway. because monasticism was no longer seen as a productive, contributing movement in Christianity. Okay? Any questions about monasticism? All right. No volunteers for the monastic life.